we will have lost the chat from the previous discussion, but we had one question that Alister, that I was, we're just about to put to Alister, which is how to do all of these things when local authorities' budgets are getting slashed, and we're asking them to do more with less. Somebody else put the question up after that, and I didn't manage to memorize it before it vanished. So if you're back in the room and you put that question on after that question about how do we do more with less, then please retype it or ask it by turning your microphone off and asking the question. But I'm going to go back to Alister and ask him if he's got any ideas of how local authorities do all of these things with the same or less resources.
Yeah, that's a difficult one, because the one thing you don't want to be doing is kind of eating into extra time. So you survive by just working extra. To me, the thing that I see is really useful is kind of the demonstration. I remember something that the Countryside Council did many years back, and Countryside Commission, demonstration farms, where you could get really good information about, the farm practice, what it was doing for wildlife conservation, etc. And I actually feel that what you could have demonstration GI projects. And I know that there's visits you do to Grangetown, etc., where there's excellent GI. But to me, the connection is to show where there's great GI, but track it back from the practice to the policy. So you work back through all the processes, you document the full policy cycle that gives rise to it, and therefore you can do the tracking that goes right back up to the national level as well. And I just feel if there was more of that sharing of the good practice, that's great. But equally, the other bits, and it's something we did with the Green Infrastructure Planning tool, which I didn't dwell too much on today, but we actually worked across, particularly in Scotland and elsewhere where we work with the local authorities, good and weak practice. So we've highlighted examples that are actually weak as well as examples that are good. And you can see, and we've justified why we feel they're weak in our scoring system. So that to me is equally as important. And I think we spend too much time just trying to show what's good without really trying to open up about what doesn't work so well. Now, that's difficult for many authorities and staff to do, simply because if something goes wrong, people generally call for people's heads. And we've got a culture now of let's sweep mistakes under the carpet. That has to change. So I think part of doing more with less is about having a culture of openness where mistakes are almost celebrated, because if you're going to screw up, let's learn from the screw up and let's not hide it. And that's one of the things that, and I mentioned an example I did in Wales. I'm not going to say exactly where, but the people in that authority know. I learned a lot early on in that cock up to then shape the strategy that I then use in the rest of my fellowship. So that was the best thing that could have happened to me in a perverse sense. But unless you learn from those mistakes, you'll continue remaking them, and you don't want to be wasting time. I think the only other thing I'd say is I put this example of Swansea down simply because they invested in a community consultation and public consultation process. That took a lot of time and money. My only concern is in looking at the strategy that's now published online, that's downplayed. The importance of that community consultation, I don't see there. It's almost like somebody's asked them to take that stuff away that was actually being celebrated. And to me, consultation, I think, is seen politically as a cost. And let's keep that bit down as much as possible. And that's the worst thing that you can do. I think you need to invest in those to get great plans that then are actually built around that community consensus. And that saves costs later down the line.
As Alister knows, and probably the rest of you know, I come from a background of community engagement. Coming right back to the original question of how do you do more with less? If you overinvest in community engagement at the start, then that gives you amazing permission to do different things with your time and to go back to the decision makers and say, well, actually, this is what your electorate say they wanted, and this is what they say are their priorities. So, you could ignore them if you choose, but this is what they're telling us.
Just very quickly, though, there is a downside to that, Pete, because Brecon Beacons did an excellent one when I was there, and we all know about that one, with the planning for real exercise, huge investment. And unless you have the non-negotiables up front, you run the risk of raising expectations and then the whole thing exploding in your face. And obviously Martin Fitton had that happen, I think, through one of the big dangers of unmanaged consultation, in the sense of you've got to admit your non-negotiables. Unless you do that up front, you run the risk of raising expectations, and that can cause so much damage.
Of course, that's community engagement 101, isn't it? It's make sure that you set out at the start what your constraints are. But hopefully that's given us some idea as to how we can prioritize the good stuff within the resources that we've got, and let's hope that they don't shrink any further. There's a whole bunch more questions have come up, so I'm going to skate swiftly over that. Marie Fowler has said that she thinks that Welsh legislation doesn't go far enough to put pressure on developers, so that the focus is on good quality green infrastructure and not just on profit. Statement rather than a question, but I'll turn it into a statement for Alister. Do you think Welsh legislation goes far enough to get developers to put pressure on developers to go for quality?
That's an interest. I mean, my answer to that is I don't like relying on any one side. So regulation as a simple one answer is too dangerous in my book, because if there was just the statutory requirement to do that, and I know a lot of people say that's what's needed, I think you've got to have the regulation, you've got to have the incentives, and you've also got to have the willingness to engage with that. Unless you've got all three of those components, you're going to have people trying to get around that system, and you're going to have huge opposition. And to my mind, I think Wales is in a far better position than a lot of other countries with the duties that you do have. And therefore, I think by having the bundle of tools, by linking the regulation that you've got, using the regulation cleverly, linking it with incentives cleverly and joined up, and linking it then with the kind of behaviours and showing that by doing this through maybe a demonstration project, you can realise more profit in a sense. That is the approach that I think works better than just piling into the regulation aspect and then having a pushback where then people are fighting or trying to get around that situation, claiming the exceptional circumstances aspect, and then it goes to that. So it's probably not satisfactory, because everybody in Wales probably might be thinking that Welsh government could do more. I actually think you've got a good range of tools, and part of the skill is using them more effectively. And I think it's bundling them together that is the opportunity space here. And also the other final point is that your development plans, the policies in those can be statutory, and therefore having good policies at that level can do what you want for developers. So I think through PPW 11, you've got the ability to create that space. And we've given you, with the examples in the policy matrix, of very strong policies that exist across large parts of Scotland and parts of England, which are doing exactly what you're suggesting. And therefore, by linking those in, I think you can achieve what you've got, with the basic background of what you've got.
Yeah. So it's almost like this Swiss cheese idea that they're using to talk about how to stop COVID spreading, so that masks by themselves aren't enough because they let some stuff out. Think of every intervention as like a slice of Swiss cheese, which has got a hole and holes in slightly different places, and it's only by stacking them all together that you stop the virus getting through, or or the developer going, well, it's easier to get around the legislation than it is to actually comply with it because I can't get around it.
Yeah, and that goes to the heart of something else maybe, which is the join up, getting the right interests when you're developing your development plan around the table to begin with, and actually getting those areas of agreement working. I think is something that's also missed at times, and Cornwall did that very well with their project, where they got a good development in practice, and they reverse engineered that to think about what are the policies that we can use that enable that practice to happen. And that's why I'm going to beat a drum about getting a process right. All too often the outcomes are spoiled by a process that maybe drags in people too far down the line, and they're just hacked off because they haven't been involved in the original part of the discussions, and that matters.
Yeah, that is so crucial. And so Jeff has come in, and he's talking about another stakeholder that we don't often think about in planning. He's saying that banks are now starting to look at climate resilience and what this means to them. What should we be saying to mortgage lenders on the resilience of their potential assets and how they can take that into account?
That's really good. And there's a guy at Loughborough, I've forgotten his name now, but I can supply it afterwards, who was a NERC fellow specifically working with the insurance industry to try and improve the way that green infrastructure was embedded into kind of insurance and risk, because risk is another great hook, because it works, it brings in so many different players that are normally outside the usual green infrastructure group. And by using these terms like risk, you can bring different players into the table here. And climate risk is a key one here. So yeah, spot on. And I think that's an area where, again, if I could say, from even speaking personally, I haven't engaged enough with understanding that side to be able to have meaningful conversations at times. And I think that's the other part. If we want these players to be part of the discussion, we have to invest in time translating to understand how we can connect with them, rather than just expect them to come to our table. So it's almost like, how do we have a dinner party that invites people to come that are outside our usual circle of friends? And that's exactly what the problem can be, because we keep inviting our own same bloody friends to our dinner parties, and therefore we don't get those extra people in. So the question is how do we engage with that? And that's where you go back to the hooks and bridges. And I think with the hooks and bridges that I had, you need a further column, which is core stakeholders. Who are those key players that play to that definition that I gave, that bring in, they're the ones that make the world go round. And that finance side is really important, because they support the developers as well. So that's an angle of joining that element up, and it's a neglected area. Apologies, I haven't got any expertise on that.
Well, the thing is, hopefully within this forum, which links public, private and third sectors, then we have got some expertise on that. I know we've got a number of consultants in the Green Infrastructure Forum. I'm not sure if we've got any actual representatives from developers, but maybe we can work through Paul Malafant and see if we can attract some on.
It's Richard... John Hillier at Loughborough. Sorry, Peter. It's John Hillier at Loughborough University. So I can provide his details, because he'd be more than willing to talk to you guys.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Richard Sumner said he got two questions, but he seems to have posed one. And I know you're unmuted, Richard. So do you want to ask your questions in person? I've done that just at the moment that he's had to rush off and stop the cat from knocking up something off the mantel shelf. So I'll ask his questions. So he asks, does Wales need to start using natural capital accounting? This is to make nature relevant to economic decision makers.
Yeah, I had that down as one of the hooks, natural capital assessments. And I think that goes back to one of the lessons I learned. I'm reluctant to say that anybody should use a particular tool, a particular approach. unless this goes back to the co-design aspect, because I think there's a danger that people say, yeah, natural capital, we ought to use it. And then you as a person do not necessarily understand how it works, but somebody else does it, produces the calculations, then you use that. And that's where I take issue, not that there's a problem with using natural capital, but it's, if you use something, you need to be part of that process that designs and takes ownership of it, which is why I love what Essex did with taking the standards that have been designed and then saying, okay, we like these bits, but that bit's missing. We want to have something that works for Essex, and it's actually something that those built environment people there signed up to over 3 or 4 workshops. So they've got real ownership and a real stake in the process. So to me, I'm ducking the question a little bit. I think it has a lot to offer, but it needs to be used in a way that people, that the local authority or whoever's using it, actually can make it work in the context, and you can get by without it. I think is also the answer. What is the problem you're trying to solve? Therefore, think about that. So the South Downs had a great evidence base. They then worked with academics and policy and practice and their own board to shape the hooks and bridges that they would use to develop and mainstream the ecosystem approach into their management plan, and then their local plan, and then their green infrastructure work that they're then done. So it was all joined up. So I think that the issue is, what's the problem you're trying to solve? What are the tools that are best used? And therefore, it's a combination. And it has to be, I think the people calling for the tool need to understand how the tool works. And as my colleague who's here today, Matt Kirby, you know, he's doing a PhD on looking at natural capital assessments of greenbelt, because nobody's actually ever done that for greenbelts, and understanding how natural capital might actually provide a better mechanism to improve the way the greenbelt is actually viewed. That could be of value, but there's got to be a clear understanding of its strengths and weaknesses. And the worry is it's got lots of weaknesses that people don't always understand.
Well, hopefully that answers Richard's question. And I mean, to me, the takeaway is that if it's useful, use it. If not, it seems like we've got a lot of other tools and techniques we could use in Wales, which might be equally effective, so long as we engage people with them. So I'm conscious we're going to overrun the time we allowed ourselves, and I don't want to take up too much of your time, Alister, but we may be able to get to the bottom of this within a few minutes. The next question on the list is, well, it's more of, again, it's a statement, so I'll ask you to comment on it, Alister, saying the silos also exist within the Welsh Government. With one hand, local authorities are asked to deliver good quality green infrastructure, green infrastructure-based developments. But on the other hand, they're asked to deliver a minimum of, say, 50 houses per hectare. So how do we reconcile those kinds of conflicting demands?
Well, I'm definitely not going to speak on behalf of the Welsh Government, but I would say even in my own university, I can speak on behalf of my own university, and we've got rigid silos as well. So if we start by saying we have silos wherever we work, Natural Resource Wales has silos, I'm sure. So the question is how do you break those silos down? Are there good examples of where silos have been broken down? And the best example I came up with is in Birmingham City Council, where the Director of Planning, Housing, Regeneration, and I think a few other things as well, Wahid Nazir he's left now because he was headhunted because I think of what he did, but he abolished those departments. He basically created an approach that was task and finish groups, that if you had a problem like the regeneration of Digbeth, his approach was, who do I need across my teams that can address that problem? And therefore, you then you got rid of the silos and you become problem orientated. And to me, the big challenge is it's not a green infrastructure problem, it's a placemaking problem. That goes back to your hooks and bridges. It's a placemaking problem, it's a placekeeping problem, or it's a climate problem. So who are the people that are needed to address the climate problem? who needs to be around the table, who are the key stakeholders. And if you take that approach, you can maybe try and break the silos in any organisation, because it's no good the Welsh government breaking a silo if there's a further silo down the line. It's a bit like road transport improvements. You create, you improve the road and you create a traffic jam further down, and more people are using the bloody road then anyway. So I think you have to be smart about the way that you address that. And I was very taken with Wahid's strategy, because he built that from studying lots of different. He was a true interdisciplinarian. He didn't know what that was. He just said that he had no one discipline or approach. He looked at what worked in management, and he based that on his own experience. So to me, that was very telling. And I had a series of taped interviews with him about why he did this. So that's why that matters to me, because it's transferable, I think. And that would be my solution. But you need that leadership. And that to me is leadership at two levels. Somebody like Wahid as a head of planning or major service, an officer, but you also need a councillor lead or a mayor or whatever, a political leader that can support that and join that up. When you look at particular initiatives like in Vancouver, where that worked with Brent Todarian when he was a chief planning officer and the mayor at the time, that working hand in hand led to transformational change. And that's key in my book. So that's why you need both components to unlock it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Alister. If anybody hasn't read the comments from Colette Bosley in the chat, they're well worth reading, because Monmouthshire County Council have done some amazing things with green infrastructure and green infrastructure strategies. And there have been a lot of links across decision makers as well as officers, which I think reinforces your point there, Alister.
Yeah, the viability issue is a wicked problem, and I've skirted that a little bit. I didn't address that specifically today, but I think the way around that in my book is to redefine viability with an environmental and social component, and that needs to come from Welsh legislation. I think you do already have that, and I think viability could be given those extra components. We couldn't do that in England, but looking at your Welsh legislation, I think you could reconfigure from the Welsh government level up downwards what viability is, and that might help.
And that might be a subject for one of our future webinars. I'm conscious that it's 3 o'clock and we're starting to lose people, because I guess their next meetings are starting. So I hope people have had the chance to read Colette's comments. I'm afraid we won't be able to get round to John's questions. He's raised some really good ones. So maybe, John, you might like to pose those via email to Alister. I'll check. Alister, would that be okay?
Yeah, I'm very happy. Obviously, these don't stay like Teams online once the meeting's shut. But if anybody's got any questions that haven't been asked or answered, or would like further, just use the email that was on my last slide. I presume, Peter, you'll share the slides, because obviously people might. There's links there that then people can use. So I'm very happy to respond there. And also, the mainstreaming website has other information and research projects I didn't have time to talk about today.
Well, Alister, thank you so much for giving so freely of your time today, and for all the work you put into the preparation. That was brilliant. And thanks to everybody for coming along today.